Hello, I hope you all are doing so well. Thank you so much for being here today. So there's a lot going on, obviously, and I feel like over the last maybe 5 or 6 months, I've kind of gone a bit underground or something. I'm not quite sure how to describe it. I've really been wrestling with the energies and working with the energies in a different way than I was used to. And it felt very awkward and uncomfortable. And really like I was trying to find something and I didn't know what I was looking for. And wasn't really sure if I was trapped or if I was on the right path or what the heck was going on. Everything has kind of surfaced over the last few days. And as per usual, the way that I work with energy is that I use my own personal experiences, my own personal relationships, things that come up in my day-to-day life as a way to understand what's going on in the world. I think as opposed to maybe an astrologer that looks at the astrology chart and draws information and understanding, I experience the interaction directly through my body, and I come to conclusions, and I make, let's say, maybe judgment calls based on how I'm seeing my own energy interact with the energy of others, and trying to decipher, what these different kind of aspects are in a way that I can then communicate. I've always kind of said spirituality and energy work is wonderful, but if we can't put it to use through our humanness in a way that really kind of helps us and allows us to continue to evolve, really what good is it, right? Because we're here to embody our light. We're here to be a divine human. We're here to be a spiritual being in a body. And that's just what this is in this lifetime. So if we're also not working in that way, at least for myself, I find it very challenging. Ideas and theories and philosophical debate is wonderful, and there's a place for that, of course. And then where do we go and what do we do with that? And so sometimes I feel like I kind of go away or kind of go underground, to kind of flush out things in perhaps a different way. Maybe that's been presented in the spiritual community. But what I've been experiencing over the last several months is kind of, and this is the thing too, I've heard other people's, let's say, theories. We talk about all these kinds of energies, right? Reptilian energies, grays, aliens, all these different kinds of concepts around the matrix. And again, all of that is interesting and beneficial to a degree. And then I always fall into this, but what do I do with it as a human? Like, if there are all of these outer forces working against us, it does create a sense of futility in many ways for me, where I constantly have to step back and say, okay, I don't know. Like, even if this does exist, what can I do about it in this moment besides go into a place of fear or a place of, I can't do anything about this, right? It's much larger than I am. So I step back into my kind of humanness, right? Of like, well, I don't know, but I've also got to pay the bills and take care of my house and my kids and live a human life, right? So if I can't destroy the reptilians or that reptilian energy that's kind of in my way or whatever it might be, I tend to retreat until such time that I have a better understanding and awareness. And this is just the way that I tend to work. So part of what I've been experiencing now, it's very clear that we need relationship and we need community. And over the course of the last 6 months, it's really a feeling that has started to develop within me that actually we come into this realm with our pods, with our tribe, with our groups, how do we get separated? All that stuff at this point, not really, not that it's not important, right? But it's not really where the energy is leading me right now. I think it's more important to establish, because the counter narrative, the counter argument, right, is that we're supposed to be sovereign beings and we're not supposed to need anyone. We're supposed to be independent on our own. And when you go looking for a relationship, that's when the problems arise, because you haven't resolved these things, right? And I tend to see it from a very different perspective, which is that we actually do need relationship. We do need sacred partnership. In fact, sacred partnership is the key to long-standing energetic stability, something that we don't experience here. And yet the reason it continuously fails is because of the distortion here. So bear with me, because I'm going to kind of get into all of this in this video. So what I have started to experience, and I've always kind of had this theory when I started talking about the dark mother energy, right? Distorted feminine energy, distorted mother energy, that it is the feminine range that is highly distorted. And to a certain degree, masculine energy will become distorted because we draw or recreate from feminine energy. And we express in this masculine range. Yes, by default, we can say distorted masculine, but that's not really what's happening, right? It's because we're creating based on distorted feminine ranges that we see distorted masculine. But what is also true is that true divine masculine energy is here. We can't see it and we can't interact with it because we're coming from a distorted range within ourselves. And this is where I've kind of railed against energy work in the spiritual community, in the sense of we can't say that we are light beings and the rest of the world is victimizing us and not seeing us for who we are, and wait for the rest of the world to change, because we also hold the distortion within ourselves, and we have to see this and acknowledge where it's at in order to really root it out. Otherwise, we continue to create relationship based on distortion and wounding. So I've been working with this, these interactions, right, in this specific relationship, let's say. And what I have found is that I will get triggered. And in my triggering, I'm like, well, let me look at this from an energetic standpoint, right? I'm getting triggered. It's because what I'm seeing is this person is doing these behaviors, right? And then I start to feel into it. And I have this story based on my past experience and based on what I know of energy. And when I would then bring this concern, right, to this individual, they were very confused and saying, well, you know, that's not what this is. That's not what I want. Like, why would I even do that? Like, where is this coming from? I don't understand. And in my mind, I'm thinking, well, yeah, but I'm feeling isolated. I'm feeling shut out of your life. I'm feeling like I don't belong in your life. Like, you don't want me there. And you're actually doing things to hurt me, to kind of almost stick that knife in and twist it. And from my perspective, that's absolutely what I was seeing and feeling. And yet when I brought these concerns to this individual, it was like, I don't get it. That's not what I'm doing. That's not how I feel about you. That's not what I want for our relationship. And as they were saying this, I realized, yeah, I know that's not where you're coming from. I know what you truly feel about us, about our relationship. And so then there were these two opposing energies within me, which I found to be incredibly scary, right? Because the realization that, all right, I know what this person is saying, but I also know what I felt so strongly. What is the disparity here? And what am I missing? Because this is really freaking scary, that I was actually creating this huge kind of gap or abyss between us in this relationship based on this initial kind of emotion or trigger I was feeling inside of myself. And I was so convinced because I see energy, I know energy patterns, I know wounding patterns, I know the ancestry and the lineage, and I can see this clearly. Like this is it, And the first time it happened, it was pretty intense, and however we managed to get through it, I don't entirely know, except that it came to the point of like, look, we both want the same thing, right? Like we both have these feelings. This is what we want to build on. This is the kind of relationship we would like to have. And that's all we really know. So everything just kind of dropped at this point, right? I thought, okay, we avoided a complete disaster. Very recently, same kind of situation. And now this is all in retrospect, right? So it wasn't like at the time I was like, oh, this is what I'm seeing. I'm giving you kind of the other side of it as well as I'm explaining this. But same situation where I felt triggered, and it involved the feelings of feeling isolated, feeling locked out, feeling alone, feeling like I was being rejected somehow. And as we were sitting down to discuss this, in my mind, I'm thinking, this is crazy. How am I ever going to have a relationship? I think I must be so broken and wounded, because it's the same pattern again now of me thinking and really believing the story that it's coming from this person. It's this person's connections that are coming through into our relationship and really pulling on us and trying to affect us. And parts of that may be true, right? But where I was engaging with it was to say, well, this is the problem. This is how it's making me feel. And yet, if that's not really the case, why am I feeling what I'm feeling? Because again, it was like, this is probably the second or third time now where we've had a similar conversation. And this is where we start to see, yeah, this is what happens in relationships, right? It's always the same issues that come up. So as we were sitting and discussing this feeling of horror came across me, where I realized, wait, there's a rhythm to this. There's a pattern in the sense that this is happening every, let's say, 2, 3, 4 weeks maybe. And I started to think, well, they talk about abuse, right? It comes in these waves, it comes in these patterns. There's a cycle of abuse where there's a building of frustration, or there's a building of energy, and then the blow up happens, right? And then there's a relief or a sense of release because of that. And that this is the abuse cycle, right? And so then I thought, well, am I just addicted to drama? Like, is that what's going on here? Which is really freaking scary, because I don't consider myself to be addicted to drama. Of course, why would I want to destroy a relationship? And yet, that's seriously, what was happening in these situations and what it really felt like. Like I was just being almost quarrelsome in a way, right? I was watching a video where I've dated lots of quarrelsome women, right? And I averted a lot of disasters because of that. And I thought, yeah, that's what I felt like. I just felt like I was looking for it, and how I was feeling like it was being perceived almost from the other person too. Like I was just looking for problems to continue to bring up and to fight about in some way. And I was really having this internal emotional experience. And I know just from the little bit of research I've done, right, that when we have emotional eruptions, like this is our nervous system, right, having a reaction to something. And so I started to think, I was discussing this with a friend too, and she said, well, did you ever stop to consider maybe it's coming from an external influence, something else? And I thought, well, yeah, my mom has kind of come up a little bit recently too, like perhaps it's the family trauma that is kind of affecting me. And I'm the kind of misplacing what I'm feeling and trying to understand it. So I'm looking at what is in my external reality that's causing this and then creating a story around it. But she said, well, did you ever think, does it follow a cycle like with the moon? And as soon as she said that, I was like, well, I'm not into this whole like the moon cycle and the moon controls me. And even though we say, especially for women, right, with your bodily cycles, that they can sometimes follow these rhythms. But then it's like, well, but the moon does control the tides. It controls the waters. We are mostly water. And it was very clear to me that there was a very kind of cyclical rhythm to these eruptions within the relationship. And so I thought, you know what, I'm just gonna take a look at this. Like because there were very specific dates that I remembered where these things happened. Or at least a general idea, of the weekends that these kind of things fell on. And so I found that 2 of the events did indeed occur around full moon times, right? But there were some kind of outliers. So I just started doing a little bit of, Googling. And I came across a study. It was done on men, interestingly. But what they did was they were tracking the behavior, the activity of the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system in relation to moon cycles, of all things. But again, this is something we know, right? Like nurses will say, well, the ER is much more crowded around the full moon. But in that study, the data shows the parasympathetic nervous system is 20% more active during the full moon. And the parasympathetic nervous system is that fight or flight response, right? It's that stress hormone. So which means that any kind of stress event or perceived stress event is going to cause a higher reaction in our bodies at that time. And then I found another article talking about a man who was suffering from some kind of mental illness, but he also had noticed a pattern, that there was a rhythm to his emotional ups and downs. So he took it upon himself to kind of chart and keep track of it. And what he found was that it also did follow this cycle. And when he brought it to his doctor decided to chart all of his patients then. And what he found was not that everyone followed let's say a specific cycle in terms of the moon, but that each individual had their own cycle. And these cycles, interestingly enough, varied on average from, I think it was 13.7 to 14.8 days, which again, I don't know that it's directly tied to the moon, but it does correlate in that sense to the new moon and the full moon cycles, right? So, which of course started my wheel spinning. Because what I really did feel in that moment where I was sitting across the table from this individual was this horror about like, whoa, there's a rhythm. Something else is triggering my nervous system beyond my control, right? So even though I have knowledge of my wounds, like I've really deeply explored my past, my upbringing, my childhood, my relationships. This is what I do. Like I just analyze the heck out of everything, to a fault probably. And yet, if I'm still feeling not only triggered, but controlled by something else other than what I can consciously understand, what kind of hope is there for humanity, And inadvertently, I had done a sketch video the other day on my other channel about sacred partnership and the trauma web, right? Navigating this trauma web, which is by default, right, what we are born into. We're all born into a family system. And for the most part, if you're watching this, it's dysfunctional family systems. And we all have variations of this. It doesn't matter who we are human beings, and this is what happens. So we are born into this web, right? And we all play a role within our family of origin. And when one person starts to step outside of their appointed role, it creates chaos in that system, right? And the system's purpose is to survive. And just what I intuitively feel about this is that this is the distortion and this is the trauma, right? It has a life of its own and it wants to survive at any cost, right? And that, again, we see this in the nervous system, right? This is what the nervous system does. It's a survival response, now taken into overdrive, of course, because those actual threats don't exist in real time, and yet we still feel it, we still experience it as if it is real. And not only that, because we were born and bred into this system, it's really a part of who we are in our consciousness too. So as we start to try to step into sacred partnership, right, which is light-based, it's heart-based, it's love-based, we start to see these things really rise to the surface because, the reason relationships fail and marriages fail is not because, well, whatever the reason is, right? But the reason they don't succeed is because the relationships are based on the trauma bonds, the wounds of the trauma, right? And this is how we are generally interacting with people. We are drawn to each other because of those energies, because we continue to validate the wounding, which makes us not have to face the truth of our wounding also, right? So it keeps it in play. It allows it to stay in play. Where we start to feel threatened is when those things rise to the surface to be seen, right? But then the body overrides that with that parasympathetic nervous system response, right? So we go into a state of fear and we will do anything to alleviate that pain. But what generally happens is that in that attempt to alleviate the pain, we are actually destroying sacred relationship and sacred partnership, which is true connection, right? True recognition of the light within another. And yet we know this is where we are supposed to be going, right? We know, and how I'm seeing it is these trauma webs of the families are really what fuel what we could call the matrix system, right? As long as we are in our dysfunction and in our trauma, we are unconscious. We are operating at deeply subconscious levels. And we're not operating from the truth of who we are. We're not operating from our true sacral energy. We are operating at a solar plexus level based on some other input, which is essentially the trauma. Now again, is this tied to the moon? Is it controlled by the moon? There's lots of theories that the moon is inorganic, that the moon is a satellite, that the moon is some kind of alien foreign energy base. I don't know. But there are certain things that I see to be true, right? Again, which is that the nervous system is triggered on a rhythmic level, a rhythmic pattern. And it most clearly brings up the trauma and the wounding. So if we're not aware of this, we will continue to feed back into those trauma cycles. So the other thing that I've noticed alongside of this then, and again, there's really no way to talk about these things. I try to protect people's anonymity, but it's like at some point doing that, it's like we have to get clear on what's really going on. My intention is never to call anyone out or to point fingers, but we all have these, these relationships with our parents, with our mothers, with our fathers, with our intimate partners. So what's been happening alongside of this, of course, is my mother's energy has come in to play as well. And what I've noticed, like there are some really deep traumas that are kind of really starting to build. And what I'm seeing, I don't know if I would describe it as a neuroses, this paranoia, but it's what happens, right? And this is what we all experience, is that when these patterns are not called out, when they are allowed to perpetuate, they continue to take on a life of its own, right? So if nobody is saying to me, like, look, I think what you're saying is actually out of line. Like, I think you're being judgmental. If nobody is calling me out on my shit, then I'm allowed to believe that what I'm saying is true, that it's valid, and I'm going to continue to create a story and a narrative based on that. So what happens in sacred partnership, right, is that person actually calls you out on your crap. Or, if it's not a verbal thing, you're going to feel it energetically. It's like this stuff cannot sustain in true sacred partnership. So it's going to cause a feeling of disconnect or stress or whatever it is. It always feels a bit gritty to me, right? Like this kind of particulate, like we're rubbing up against something that we can't quite define. So it feels unsettling quite often. And this is generally where we would tend to run, right? And say, well, this is so uncomfortable. I can't stand being in here. I have to get out of here. And yet what's happening is that your wounding is coming up and your attention is being drawn to it. But are you going to turn around and blame it on the other person and use that as an excuse to continue in your own wounding? Or are we going to sit down and really look at this and dismantle this? So part of what I have been able to see kind of cross-referencing all of this, right, is how there are these stories now that have been allowed to perpetuate, and this is in the lineage, right? So there's a level of a lot of abuse, of course, but it creates these feelings of being violated. But also there's a lot of like hoarding energy of wanting to hold on to things which actually don't serve any kind of purpose. But as long as I have accumulated, I feel like I have ownership of something, right? But then the fear of losing that, and not only that, but there's been this energy of, let's say, robberies, people coming in and taking things, right? So this deep sense of being violated, and of course that can happen in all realms, right? It can be emotional, physical, psychological, but it does start to create a bit of insanity. And I'm seeing this pattern now too, where I remember, my grandmother would blame my sister, like she's coming in and she's stealing things. And I remember my mother being horrified about it, but also kind of in some ways going along, like not really just putting a stop to it either, right? But there are, at a certain age, after this stuff has perpetuated for so long, you can't really just go in and say, well, that's not true. It's so deeply embedded in the subconscious now as well. And it's really hard to start to root out, which is kind of what I'm starting to notice with my mom too. It's like, I have this fear now of even asking questions of her to clarify things, because I have a sense of, if I go in here and actually ask the question that's being avoided, I'm afraid I'm going to open a can of worms, and I'm not even going to know how to deal with it, right? It's going to bring up deep-rooted emotional pain. And I don't know if I have the capacity to, number one, not engage in my own wounding with her, but number two, like hold the space for this level of healing that needs to happen, while we're sitting in a car. Like, this is not kind of a session, right? It's not kind of where someone is coming and saying, yeah, I know I have things going on that I need to heal. This is very kind of unconscious stuff that's happening. But again, the awareness that I'm having that, okay, the reason this stuff has been going on for so long is that nobody is actually seeing it, pointing it out, calling it out for anyone to even have the potential to heal it. So we're seeing this in the larger world, right? We're perpetuating, allowing these stories and these narratives to continue, which is all about victimization. It's all about what has been done to me, my wounding. You need to validate my wounding and share with me in my pain and tell me I'm right. And yet, a lot of it is actually kind of bullshit. Like, yes, there have been wounding, and I have been a victim in many ways, right? I have been subjected to abuse. But also, those things don't happen in a vacuum, right? And so we have to take ownership of where we have this distorted feminine energy and understand how it plays out within us, how we perpetuate that victim abuser cycle, right? Because we're not seeing it clearly, so we continue to engage with the abuser. And again, I'm not saying it's anyone's fault for being, like, of course not, right? I've been in situations myself where I've been subjected to huge amounts of abuse, physical, psychological, emotional, what have you, right? And I'm not saying anyone deserves that at all. What I am saying is that will continue. Those patterns of getting into relationship like that will continue for me unless I can step back and see where I'm getting pulled into that cycle, right? Which means that there's something in me that's not clearly seeing what's happening. And I contribute in the sense that if I don't know what's happening, I am actually acting unconsciously and allowing whatever is within me that is unhealed to play out in that relationship and to continue to cycle through the abuse and the trauma and the wounding. So what is really tricky is that we have to see this and feel this and know this in order to know where the separation needs to occur, right? So, for example, with my mother, I'm not going to be able to go in and kind of paint her this picture and she's going to be like, oh, you're right, I need to change. I can feel the manipulation going on and the things that are not being said, but for me to get upset about it and to get triggered by it also is not helpful, right? So there's a point now where I have to say, and again, this goes back to this kind of web or this matrix energy we each have through our families, but then that larger, again, 3D matrix system that it fuels and feeds and contributes to. which is where I have to step back and say, I see what's happening. It's not necessarily my job to go in and fix it. I'm not going to be able to fix it. But in my thinking that I should call this out or try to fix it, I actually jump in and become a part of that web too, right? So what I have found, which is very hard, because there's almost a part of, I don't know if it's like an ego thing. I know it's not, right? But I don't really have the words yet to describe what's happening. But there is a part of me that feels like, but I need to resolve. I don't want to ignore, and I don't want to not have a relationship with her, right? So how do I have a relationship? And yet, and maybe this is just a cycle and it will pass, but there is this kind of, let's not talk about it. Let's not call it out for what it is. So I have to really pull back and actually not engage in those areas, which means that, what this partnership is showing me, what this individual is coming with, is this deep ability to kind of flush things out, right? By asking questions and clarifying. And I realized with my mom and with my family, I don't do that. Like, I just allow people to talk and talk and talk, and I'm like, okay, whatever. But there's an inner fear that rises up in me when I think about, okay, I'm not understanding what you're saying here. Like, you're kind of jumping around. What do you mean when you say this? Or what do you mean when you say that? There's a deep sense of terror that arises, a sense and a feeling that if I start to ask questions, I'm going to get stuck down here in this prison with all of this winning, right? It's not just her, it's that entire family lineage now that has been built on this sense of feeling violated, and the paranoia now that surrounds that, right? So I also can see now where I'm taking this into the other relationship, and as I'm feeling isolated, locked out, ignored, abandoned, whatever it might be, what I have noticed is, like, in the course of having the discussion, I think, well, okay, so next time when I'm feeling this, I just need to, like, ask you and clarify, like, what's going on? This is what I'm feeling. Can you help me understand what's going on? Because this is what I'm feeling from you, right? But my fear of engaging with that relationship based on the level, the depth of level and distortion that's been going on in my own family of origin, right? I'm transferring that fear now into this relationship. It's absolutely not serving this relationship. In fact, the inability to ask questions and to clarify is destroying this relationship over here, right? So we can see where the learned behaviors in the trauma system pass through we hold it in our body, right? It's a pattern and way of being. And we now engage in the same way in the potential sacred partnership. And yet it doesn't work there, right? Our not asking questions destroys the relationship. So this is one way to kind of know what we're also dealing with, right? Like, over here is this trauma. Here's the unhealthy behaviors I learned. And when I take those same behaviors over here, does it allow the relationship to perpetuate in, of course, an unhealthy way? Or do I start to feel the breakdown of the relationship? And feeling almost a breakdown of the relationship, to me, is a good sign going on. So then needing to go back in and establish that point of connection, right? So the other thing I noticed too in the cycle of these kind of triggers and breakdown of the relationship was that when we would have these conversations after the fact, we weren't really coming to any new conclusions, like, oh my gosh, okay, here's what's happening, here's what I need to do, here's what you need to do, we're going to resolve this problem. Again, it was more a sense of, I'm being triggered, I don't really understand. But there was a sense of relief, right? After we would have these conversations, there was that release that I talked about, that we often see in, like, abusive cycles, right? Which again was kind of terrifying to me, because I thought, yeah, am I addicted to drama here? Is that what's going on? What I realized was that what satiated these intense feelings of isolation and abandonment, it's not that we had a conversation about the problems. It's that we were connecting at a deeply emotional level. And not only that, but I felt incredibly safe in the space of this conversation, right? So we know that human connection and a feeling of safety and security is vital for healing our nervous systems. So, this is my unofficial, unprofessional opinion and theory. These relationships, sacred partnership, so vital to what the planet needs right now. And yet we have to kind of unravel all these parts and pieces and understand how we can put this all back together, right? So it's important to push forward in sacred relationship, but it's important to understand we're going to get triggered in our nervous system. We're going to project our woundings onto the other. Can we find that rhythm based on this 13.7 to 14.8 day pattern where we can start to go in and circumnavigate these intense feelings that we're having, right? So my thought in my relationship is, okay, I need to look at when this next full moon is coming up. And even more than that, it's these interim, so the new moon is here now too, right? But in the course of the next few weeks, do I start to feel this rising within me? And rather than now waiting until after the fact when I really feel awful, can I approach this person and say, here's what I'm feeling. Can we sit down and can we just connect, right? At a deeper emotional level, instead of waiting for the explosion to happen and see what happens here. Because my theory is that somehow these triggerings of the nervous system, right, and the energy of trauma that we then output as a result of that feeds the matrix. Feeds the moon matrix. I don't know if that's actually a thing. It's starting to feel like there is really something to this because, again, I did a sketch video the other day on my other YouTube channel. I'll put a link to that below. And sometimes I don't know why I sketch the way I sketch, right? But I go back and then I'm like, oh, that's why I put this arc here, right? As someone starts to move out of that family web, there's an energy that comes in almost like a satellite dish, right? Almost like a transmission that tries to pull that person back into the distortion. This is what, I've heard theories, right? Of like when we try to establish sacred partnership, all the false energy that comes in, all the karmic attacks that come in, we can label things in all different kinds of ways. We can blame it on dark energies. And whether or not that's true, I don't know. What I do know is true is that labeling things in order to make an excuse for things being the way they are, right? So for example, for me to say, well, it's the dark mother energy, that's what's causing me to freak out on you, like I can't help it. That's not acceptable anymore. It's absolutely not acceptable. I have to take responsibility for where this is within me. And even if it's coming from some kind of external realm, I cannot believe that there is not something I can do to alleviate that response within me. The more I know, the more tools I have, the better equipped I am to circumvent this explosion from happening within me, which affects this other person, it affects our greater realities, our lives, our families, and it ripples out. And I do believe this is the level of responsibility we have to start taking, right? Instead of just saying, which again, victimhood, it is an industry, right? So much business is built on the fact of keeping us in our victimization. I was abused. I was traumatized. You have to recognize this. You have to change to serve my wounded feelings. That's absolutely not going to work moving forward. It's a huge belief system that we have got to overturn here, and it's most predominant in the spiritual community, unfortunately, because we all seem to think there's going to be some kind of energetic bolt of lightning that's going to come in and set everything right side up. But even if it does, we have been mirroring in our fields this trauma and this wounding, right? It's how we've been existing. It's how we have been being. It is within us as the kind of being that we are, right? That we are reflecting out into the world. So even if that illusion is cut off, well, now what excuse do we have? Like, it is in our biology. It's cycling through our systems. How do we come to terms with this, right? And then, of course, like, is that outer breakdown actually going to happen? Which will, let's say, if it is some kind of, lunar force that's being, transmitted into our fields. If that breakdown never comes, do we just continue to live in this energy of being out of control and projecting our wounding onto other people in order to destroy true relationships that are actually here to heal humanity? I can't believe that that's the answer either. But what I have seen for myself is that the more that I allow myself to see these patterns, to understand these energies, to take responsibility for it, the better life becomes. So I do believe this is possible. I do believe it has to happen on an individual level, right? Because there's so much talk about wanting to enter into sacred community with other energy beings, right? And yet, if we are each holding this wounded story within ourselves, right? Like, I'm not being recognized for my light. Nobody's recognizing my gifts and skills. If we all come into community with that type of energy, I have a feeling we're still going to be projecting it on one another, right? Like, well, they think they're better or smarter, or they think they're more talented, or who are they to blah, 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 make that comment, right? This is why community can't really exist yet, because we're still operating from our individual wounded patterns. Whether or not it's controlled by something in us or outside of us, it's happening within us. It's happening in our nervous system. There are things that we can do to alleviate these intense responses. And can we look at the pattern of it and start to develop some kind of protocol around that, rather than allowing it to control us, right? It's like, well, Mercury's in retrograde, so everything's just kind of on hold and falling apart. Well, that's partially true, right? But also, we are, and this is where this concept of being a planetary body is so important, right? Like, yes, the Earth is experiencing these influences on her, as are our planetary bodies. But we have a level of consciousness where when we know these things, the power of it is lessened. The grip of that control is lessened. This is how consciousness and conscious energy works. It's a universal law. And could it be that humans need to embody this first before the actual kind of consciousness of the Earth is allowed to rise to the surface, right? If we are fueling and feeding this unconscious control, subconscious control of the matrix, is that what is perpetuating then in the planetary body itself as well? Because we know we are very much coded like the Earth herself. We have to be in order to be here. So just some food for thought. But absolutely, without a doubt, I know there is a rhythm and a pattern to these energies that arise within me. And beyond that, just from what I've kind of been receiving in my own work, through the light language videos I'm putting out, right? This idea of the solar sacral, which I always believe the sun, right? It's like this powerful energy, whether it's this actual sun here with the Earth, I don't know for sure, but there's something about this solar energy, right? And also the impression I've been getting that, the solar plexus as our will center, we've been working from a place in our will center which is not actually driven by our true sacral energy. It's some kind of affected sacral energy, right? So some kind of external impulse we have been willing ourselves to create through, but it's not our own true sacral range. It's some kind of distorted outside energy, which I do believe is affected by this kind of dark mother, dark feminine energy. So, which is scary to think about, but also incredibly exciting when we think that, well, everything we've actually created here has been through distortion. And when we figure this out, when we start to release this, it's a whole different opportunity now to create from the truth of our own light, from the truth of who we are. So where are we still not kind of understanding this in ourselves? Where are we still creating subconsciously, unconsciously? I mean, creation by default is still creation, but what kind of creation is it, right? So we really want to be conscious of where we're coming from at all times, in all realms, in all dimensions, and to create from this space of integrity and honesty and truth within ourselves. So it's a lot of what I'm seeing in the world, but in the energetic and spiritual community too, which is what is, it's so troubling about these times. We just want to be over and done with this, and yet it's some harsh truths that are coming up right now, which is that we've got to take responsibility. Where is this within us? Every time we are saying someone else is doing it, we have to turn that around, and we've got to find it within ourselves. There's no way that we are connected to our pure light if we are saying something outside of us is the problem when it comes to another person. So, I've been having, these words, it's like, it's inconvenient truths, right? It's comfortable lies. What are the stories we tell ourselves to kind of pacify ourselves, to keep us out of true healing? But what are the uncomfortable truths? Kind of these harsh realities and harsh truths that we have to face. And they're not pleasant. And yet the beauty of it is knowing that, yeah, it's been really messed up, which would explain why the world is so messed up and why we feel so messed up. So there is great potential in all of this now too. And that's where we have to kind of keep our eye on at this point. We've created massively on a distorted level, massively. And it's not because we've been connected to our light and people have been holding us down. We've been creating from a distorted level as well in many ways. So that's what's on the table. That's what's coming up, at least as far as I'm experiencing it. I'm going to leave this here. I hope this was helpful. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Take good care.